know me, um, my name is Pastor Ignacio Silverio. Everyone actually calls me Pastor Nacho. I pastor here. Hey, everyone. So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Pastor Ignacio Silverio. I pastor here in the Nashville area in Tennessee. And what I'm going to share with you is just something, it's an area I've been trying to grow in. It's an area I've been honestly working on for quite a while now. My wife and I joke about how I was possibly born similar to the Grinch with a heart that's about 3 times smaller than the average human being. And that's because several factors go into it. And part of it is I'm a choleric. For those of you who do not know, you can look it up. Just quick Google search what in the world is a choleric. Second thing, I'm a type A, very task oriented person. And so, because of this, sometimes, and you can ask those who are closer to me, sometimes what I say and what I do comes across really harsh. And sometimes it seems like I have very little to low empathy. But it's not the case. I really, really care deeply for so many things, for so many people. And what I'm going to share with you today is just something that's been very helpful for me in my personal life in relationship with my children. For those of you who don't know, I have 4 children. I have a 15-year-old, his name is David. I have a 12-year-old whose name is Sammy. And then I have twin boys who are 9 years old, and their names are Daniel and Esteban. And so, and then I've been married to my wife for 16 years, and her name is Paulina. And we have a pretty great relationship, always trying to make it better. But what I'm going to share with you today is something that oftentimes comes naturally in relationships, especially in romantic relationships. It almost comes intuitively when we begin dating or when we begin to see the other person that we are attracted to and we want to win their hearts. But oftentimes, as the relationship just goes on and we get a little more comfortable, it's almost like we forget to do these things. And part of the pushback that some of you may have as you're listening to this is going to be like, well, if I do what you actually say, and if I follow your advice, there's a possibility that it may not be reciprocated upon me, and that is true. That is very, very true. Um, but this is something that Jesus emphasizes, and later Paul's the writing that we're going to look at. Paul's the one who later describes it like this is what we are called to do as Christians, as Jesus followers, to a world that is begging for something different, for some kind of hope. And so this is the kind of love that God asks of us to share with the world, not just in romantic relationships, but especially in romantic relationships, especially in marital and in parental relationships. So, this is me sharing with you just my journey in learning to love, and hopefully, as you're listening, you're not pushing back too much. Just to get started, early on in our my dating, my wife, and I'm sure all of you have done this. There are things that you will do for your partner or the person you're attracted to that you would have never dreamed of doing. For instance, they'll be like, someone will say in the relationship, like, "Oh, I'm into running," and even though you have never ran a day in your life, you'll be like, "Oh yeah, I'm into running," and then you'll go out and buy a new pair of shoes and just try it all in for the sakes of trying to win the other person's heart. So this happened with my wife and I. We were dating, or we were even in the pre-dating. We were just like really attracted to each other. And one day, she wants to go rollerblading, and she asked me like, "Hey, do you want to go rollerblading?" Which, to be honest, it scared me. I used to skateboard. But the benefit of skateboarding versus rollerblading is if you're going too fast and you're gonna eat it, which is the term that we use for falling off the skateboard, is you can bail. You can jump off the skateboard. The skateboard will keep rolling, and you can just tuck and roll or just catch yourself because you don't have wheels on your shoes. With rollerblades, it's a completely different story. And so, One day, my wife, Paulina, at that time, just the girl I was interested in, she invites me to go rollerblading. And we go to this elementary school, and we're rollerblading. I keep falling. She keeps holding my hand, picking me up, which I'm like, oh, this is awesome, since she's holding my hand. And at some point, after falling enough and after getting a semi groove of it, she invites me to go up to this little hill at the school. And the hill is honestly, like, I've been to it, it's not that high. But we go up to this little hill, and she invites me to rollerblade down it because in her mind she's like, if you go downhill, it'll be so much easier for you to learn this. And in my mind, I'm thinking, if I go down that hill, I'm gonna die. But she's super confident in her rollerblading skills. So she goes down the hill, she goes forward, she goes backwards, she like turns midway. And while that hill, like I said, is not that big, to me at that moment, it looked like Mount Everest. Now, the thing you have to understand about physics is that there is a certain position that we all get when we're scared. That position comes very natural. Like when someone yells "heads up," you naturally like duck and go into an immediate fetal position. And so this position is also the position in rollerblading when you want to pick up speed. And so, unfortunately, after becoming a little bit impatient with me, Paulina looks at me and she's like, "Oh, come on, Nacho, just go." And she gives me a gentle push. At that time, I thought it felt more like a shove, but it was honestly just a gentle little push. And she pushes me down this hill, and I get scared, and so naturally I go down into fetal position and I just pick up tremendous amounts of speed that I would have never imagined to pick up on this little rollerblade. And so what I hear next is just these poles, these metal poles flying by me, and it's just like one by one. Eventually, luckily, my legs start to shake so bad that my right leg does a turn, and the pole and I collide, and we become one for a split second. Paulina comes up to me, and she asked like if I was okay. And my response is that even though my entire body was screaming, "No, I'm in pain," like, what in the world were you thinking? My mind and the words that came out of my mouth were, "Yeah, I'm okay." And then she asked me a follow up question. And her follow up question was, "Do you want to try again?" Now, at this point, it's like, my body's like, "No, like, run away. Don't do this." But the words that came out of my mouth again were, "Yeah, yeah, I'll do it again." And the reason I wanted to do it again was because I wanted to do it again for her. So, back now, going to the text that I'm going to read. It's First Corinthians chapter 13. We've all read this, we've all heard this. But as I'm reading this and as I'm sharing this, rather than thinking about wanting to do this in order for it to be reciprocated, or doing this, as we read it, a lot of the things that Paul says, you're going to be like, yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I should really do that in my relationship with my kids, in my relationship with my wife, in my relationship with those I care about. And so I'm going to go ahead and read this fairly quickly. And this is what Paul says. He says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not arrogant, it is not rude, it doesn't insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful, it doesn't rejoice at wrongdoings, but rejoices with the truth." And we read all that and we're like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, we should be that way, we should love that way. And if you're not thinking that, definitely one of the things that you should be thinking, or you can be thinking, is, man, I don't know what that looks like, but it would be awesome to be loved in that way. Like, I have never experienced that personally, but I would give anything for someone to love me in that way. And then Paul ends this statement, ends this whole phrase with four different words. And in these four different words, he's trying to just give us one main idea, and it's this. He says this in verse 7: "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things." And what Paul is trying to tell us, And it's what I've been trying to one apply with my kids and with my wife, especially, is this idea that in every relationship we are in, it doesn't matter what kind of relationship it is. It can be a friendship relationship, it can be a parent-child relationship, it can be a husband-wife relationship. That in every relationship we come across, whether it's with fellow Christians or whether it's with unbelievers, uh, any relationship we come across, we're eventually going to be faced with this choice. And we're faced with this choice because in every relationship, eventually there comes a time when there is a gap between what we see and what is actually real, between what we see and how we perceive it. And so when these moments come, and when there's a gap in the relationship, we are faced with a choice. And that choice is simply this: do I choose to believe the best, or do I choose to assume the worst? Do I choose to believe the best, or do I choose to assume the worst? So when you text your wife, when you text your spouse, when you text that person you care about or your child, and they don't respond immediately, where does your mind go? Do you choose to believe all things, hope all things, endure all things, or do you choose to assume the worst? Does your response sound more like, you know what, I know they care about me and they wouldn't ignore me on purpose, but maybe they're just busy. Maybe their phone died. Maybe they misplaced it. Maybe their phone is on silent. Or is your response more of along the lines of, yeah, I know it. I knew it. They're ignoring me again. See, this is what I'm talking about, and this is why I get so frustrated. Or when someone forgets to pay a bill, does your mind say, see, I knew it. I knew you were irresponsible. I know you were irresponsible with that. That's why I have to do everything myself. Or does your mind say, you know what? I think you're just distracted. I think you just got caught up with your day, and it makes sense. I mean, I make mistakes, you make mistakes. And so in relationships, Paul's telling us that, especially in keep in mind that when Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13, it was not written for one day to be used in marriage services. Rather, he writes this just as general advice to all believers who claim to follow Jesus, that in these relationships that we want to encounter, in these Jesus relationships that we want to have, we are supposed to choose to believe the best, and instead of assuming the worst in every situation. That day that I ran into a pole, I I honestly, it naturally came to my mind that Paulina had no ill intent in shoving me down this hill that, really beat me up with this pole eventually. But rather, I was like, you know what? She just wanted me to have fun. And so when she asked me, do you want to go again? I was like, yeah, I do. The problem is that every now and then, as the relationship endures, we sometimes lean in to assuming the worst instead of continuing to lean into believing the best. Learning to love in this way is what we're called to do as Jesus followers. It's what Jesus asks of us when he says, I want you guys to love one another the same way I have loved you. I hope that throughout this day, and honestly, I would give it, 14 days, maybe try it for 30 days, and just see where you're at. See how you line up with this. Do you naturally tend to be a person who leans towards assuming the worst in every situation? Or do you naturally lean towards a direction where you start believing the best in every situation? I hope that as we learn to walk with Jesus a little more and closer and reflect his character more and more, that we will learn to lean into believing the best, or as Paul puts it, to bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, and endure all things. Let me pray with you. Father, I just pray that you will guide us in leaning in towards believing the best instead of assuming the worst. May we reflect your character more and more as we draw closer and closer to you, for we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Take care and God bless.